I'm Don Kostelec. I live in southeast Boise. I have a degree in transportation planning and community development, and kind of a hybrid degree of transportation engineering or transportation systems planning, probably more precisely. I moved to Boise in 2002 from Chicago. I worked for Chicago Transit Authority. My wife and I met in Chicago. She's from 1800s homesteaders in eastern Idaho. So at least I have some legitimacy and don't have the California background that gets the scorn that some of us get from time to time. I worked for first 6 years after coming here with Chicago Transit Authority, and then for Ada County Highway District from 2002 to 2008, and managed a lot of their planning and programming. I sat on the Compass committees, the Valley Ride committees. I was deposed as part of the City of Boise versus ACHD USTIC widening lawsuit. Really am being frustrated with that, both career-wise and personally. I moved 2,000 miles away back to southern Appalachia in Asheville, North Carolina, near where I grew up. So if you hear the southern twang at times of this, that's where that comes from. It comes by legitimately. I lived there for 9 years. Asheville, from a political perspective, you might consider would be pretty progressive if you know the reputation it has. Some call it the San Francisco of the East.
Oh, wait. Wow.
The interesting part was I lived in what would be called a streetcar suburb there, probably very similar to the north end, probably more similar to the east end of Boise, maybe even some parts of the Bench. It wasn't a very polished area because of the terrain. We didn't have sidewalks in our neighborhood, but we only had 18-foot wide residential streets, which people would kind of go, what in the world? How did the fire department get there? You'd think the whole city would have burned down in the last 160 years if you had the fire department tell the story over street widths. But I got frustrated. I got frustrated because I was about 3 miles from downtown. I commuted by bike most days, but my family and I couldn't ride safely downtown. Both the terrain and the lack of protected, safe facilities. We had a park in our neighborhood. We converted our NASCAR track to a bicycle velodrome called the Melodrome. We could not ride to that park safely as a family, and I went, you know what? I left the place when I left Boise that as a city proper in certain sections, we could do that. And as my daughter got to an age where she wanted to experience more independence and freedom through those things, realizing let's find an opportunity to come back. So in 2016, the summer we did, and I purposely made a decision because I experienced that. I saw what was happening here. And for those of you that live in the western part of this valley, bless you, because that is a very tough decision and a very tough future because of a lot of ways and a lot of the ways we boxed ourselves in. I chose to live in an area that I could commute downtown via the Greenbelt, get my family there, and I'm charging my bike light now as we speak so I can get home after this. I share an office with Idaho Walk Bike Alliance. I'm on their board. And today, in asking them, should I go gentle tonight? Or should I give the Jonathan Edwards Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God, Hellfire and Brimstone sermon? They said, go Hellfire and Brimstone. So I'm going to do that. And it's meant to be provocative. If the cartoons at the beginning didn't show that, then I don't know what will. And mainly, it's from this standpoint of I've realized a lot of things of 15, 16, 17 years in this profession. And that's a lot of the stuff we get told as citizens, as agency staff, as elected officials about our transportation system. If you trace it back to its roots and you trace back the technical elements of it, at best, we've been misinformed. At worst, we've been misled. And what I hope to do with this is give you enough nuggets of information, whether you're an elected official, a citizen, a neighborhood member, a commuter that hates the slog every day by car, deals with it for bikes, wants a better transit system. I want you to ask better questions. It's the Citizens Planning Academy. I want to build your capacity to ask a better question. And at the end of this, it's not to say thou shalt never and forever widen a road, or widen an intersection. But when I see the fact that we have 7x7 lane intersections that cost $9 million with no functional ability to maintain them in the future, I worry about that. I worry about that for myself as I grow older. I worry about that for my daughter. And I worry about it as a state that claims to be fiscally conservative, yet most of the decisions we make for transportation in this valley are what I would say are antithetical to that notion. And that's what I want to arm you with. So we'll start with a quote here. No individual raindrop ever considers itself responsible for the flood. In transportation terms, the best I've seen, and this was on a bus shelter advertisement, which if you know a nonprofit that can do it here, let's do it. And it said, you're not stuck in traffic. Who said it?
You are traffic.
You are traffic, right? The decisions we make of where to live and what to buy, and by God, we got to have that third bay RV on our home, mean we've made a decision. And we're no more or less culpable for that when we're sitting in this situation than the person sitting next to us. And we don't like to admit that. That's hard to do. We like to talk about our personal freedoms and our individual liberties in this country. But I think in this paradigm, we've compromised a lot of that. I'm working on a series of things. If you know the group Strong Towns, they picked up on this of a series I wrote back in December for Christmas. I called it the 12 Days of Safety Myths. And it's a lot of things we get told in the transportation realm that when you trace them back to what actually makes us safe, don't hold a lot of water. And really today, I kind of bring that myth busting here. And here's why. If you were to go right now through the agendas of Compass, our regional planning organization, our Idaho Transportation Department, the efforts by ACHD, the efforts by Meridian, Ada County, Eagle, and others, one of our region's highest priorities is to widen Chindan Boulevard from Eagle Road out to Caldwell. We are going to go to the legislature and ask for $100 and some odd million of special money from non-transportation revenues to widen that road. Yet this man in a wheelchair uses the center turn lane of Chindan every day to get where he was going. Do you think the completion of the sidewalk network on Chindan in Garden City is part of that legislative request?
No, it's not.
It is not. And our state policies tell us to deal with this man's basic freedom and basic safety needs, that an estimated $12 million completion of the sidewalks in Garden City is solely on the shoulders of the 12,000 people of Garden City? On a state-designed, a state-maintained, and a state-managed facility? Where are our priorities? Why in that legislative request are we not asking for an additional 10% for this man's safety? So that's why I kind of mocked this last year with the hashtag Infrastructure Week of going, excuse me, sir, did you know that reducing congestion on Chindan is one of our region's top priorities? Think he cares about that? Think the 17,000 people in this county that don't have access to their vehicle care about that? What do they care about, and who's representing them? So that's where I come from. That's where my passions stand, and that's why I'm going to press the envelope a little bit. Let's look at our valley. Think about cities that develop in concentric circles. Think about a flat city like a Phoenix or a Houston or an Indianapolis. You have a central business district, and you have these rings that grow out from it. Our older cities, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, and even Salt Lake City, that have constraints such as oceans, kind of grow in a half concentric ring. Boise's interesting, and in kind of looking at city development patterns, really only maybe New Orleans and Miami compare to it and create this conic or funnel shape. So if you think about downtown Boise, and you think about the foothills to the north and the New York Canal to the south, we have essentially this alluvial fan of growth that happens. Well, what does that do for our transportation system? Highway 44 comes into downtown Boise. Chindan Boulevard into downtown Boise. I-84 into downtown Boise. These three major east-west corridors all end within about 3 blocks of one another, right? What feeds it? Highway 55 from the north and Avamore. Highway 16 coming from Gem County and Emmett. Eagle Road from its central points out to either of those three corridors. Highway 16 is planned for a freeway-type expansion. Highway 55 and the roads to the west in Canyon County. Highway 69 to Kuna. All feed into three roads that end within 3 blocks of one another in downtown Boise. Then we have Franklin. And then we have Fairview. And then we have Ustick. And if I just add up what some of those would be feeding into the downtown core, I get about 35 lanes. So are we going to accommodate that? Should this be the Downtown Boise Association's Vision 2040? Right? We're going to say we have to deal with pipes that large to bring them all here, and if we bow to the highway engineer's desires, we'd want to do that. Do we let a plumber design our house? Not usually, but in some instances that's there. And I'll actually prove the water flow theory to be a myth later, but it's a good one to use at this point in time. So I'm thinking of myself tonight as a little bit of Mythbusters, and these are the kind of myths I'm going to bust a little bit. We must widen roads for the economy. Federal standards require it. Wide, fast roads are safer. But if we don't widen the roads, where's the traffic going to go, right? And of course, it's what the market commands. We're just dealing with the market. So let's dive right in. We must widen roads for the economy. We had a big ribbon cutting celebration out in Canyon County a few months ago. Commuters rejoice. I-84 stretch will finally be widened thanks to a $90 million grant. And a quote from a politician that will remain nameless: "We will all be safer and more prosperous in the days to come." Caldwell, Idaho was probably the city in Idaho that was most bisected by the interstates. And if you look at the history of that neighborhood, where you see the hotel and the basketball courts and the parks, that neighborhood has never recovered. That neighborhood is not prosperous. We did a health analysis in Canyon County, and when you look at the census tracts and the people that live between the Nampa-Caldwell Boulevard, the railroad tracks, and I-84, they are sitting in a toxic soup of air. Are they prosperous? Will they be made more prosperous for this? Maybe, maybe not, but I don't think we've scrutinized that enough. We stand up there with a big check. Our governor, our ITD director, somebody from Washington, and the governor said it's so important to the future of the state, it's so important to the economy, it's so important to the safety of every citizen in the state of Idaho that we do this project. And I wish we would give those statements and things a little more scrutiny. I don't doubt that adding a lane in each direction to make I-84 6 lanes is needed. 6 lanes kind of is an urban functionality thing. You've got the outside lanes for vehicles to merge on and off. You've got the center lanes for through trucks. You've got the left lanes for through vehicles. That's a pretty sensible thing to look at. But if we look at some of the results and promises, we might question them. The Institute of Transportation Engineers, now think about that for a second. Institute of Transportation Engineers published an article in their journal 5 years ago called Decisions, Values, and Data, Understanding Bias in Transportation Performance Measures. And it gets at these things. When you hear, well, we have to widen I-84 because of freight. If we wanted to widen I-84 because of freight, why wouldn't we give freight 2 dedicated lanes? It's not the freight traffic that's causing the congestion. It's the local commuter traffic that's causing the congestion. But we don't want to admit that in our circles, and we don't necessarily want to address those solutions all the time. This article cited a bunch of research. One, adaptations to congestion. Adaptations, key word, such as increases in transit and population density, have been shown to ward off the detrimental economic effects that are assumed to result from congestion. Another piece of it, economies do not stagnate as a result of congestion. This was a longitudinal 20-year study of 88 different metropolitan areas of the United States that came up with this finding. The best predictors of economic growth have to do more with a dense urban core and regional economic demand than the quantity of the transportation infrastructure. And one of the authors of this article at the time was a guy named Wes Marshall at the University of Colorado. And one of the things that happens in academia is it's not just one study coming up with this. It's, is the study results repeatable? And he started doing that. And he did find that they are repeatable. And if you look at any of the metrics of what the most robust economies are in our country right now, where are they? New York, Portland, Seattle. Some of those places that also make the list of some of the worst congested places, but they're ones that are explicitly not going out and spending $1.5 billion to widen a freeway like they did in Houston. And after they did that in Houston, the traffic delays were worse, right? So how can we start to look at these things a little differently? Came up with this cartoon. We thought all this road widening was going to solve traffic congestion. Well, maybe if we add Boise and Owyhee counties, we could get a few more lanes in each direction. The joke that traffic engineers said the new travel models tell us we need to widen Ada County by 2040. And if you've been in some of the Compass discussions and others, yes, I'm reaching on this, but maybe not that much. So question for the crowd. From 2000 to 2014, how much money was spent widening roads in Ada County?
A lot.
A lot. That's not a very specific number for academic purposes.
Billion?
What's a lot? $1 billion. Other guesses? 1.5. We'll do the, what was it, the old Price is Right game, lower.
2.3.
800 million, lower.
500.
Higher. 700. $700 million between ACHD and ITD based on their sources, their impact fee program, the Compass tip, and the ITD Garvey program summary. About 250 million of that is ACHD on the local roads and intersections. The remainder is ITD for that. So what has happened during that time? The reason I use 2000 to 2014, I can go to the Texas Transportation Institute's Urban Mobility Scorecard. They've been tracking Boise as one of the top 100 metro areas in the country, at least for this time frame. And in that time, going back to Family Feud style and Richard Dawson, if survey says, the average cost of a commuter has risen $330 a year.
What's that mean?
If your cost of congestion, of you driving in Ada County in 2000 cost you $500 a year, average cost per commuter, congestion delays.
How is that calculated?
Gas, wear and tear on car, those kind of things. 2014, their estimate was it was now $833 a year. So $700 million investment in road widening got us a 66.3% increase of average commute costs due to congestion on the roads. Average annual hours of congestion delay per auto commuter, leave it to an academic institution to come up with that title, went up by 9 total hours, 33% roughly, from 27 hours of congestion delay in a year in 2000 to 37 in 2014. So if we look at some metrics like that, we're like, what is this overt expenditure on this getting us? Again, I'm not saying don't widen a road, but where do we get to put $700 million into a pool and actually decide how it gets divvied up? Instead, what Compass does is they essentially take the highway programs of ACHD, ITD, adopt them on their own, pass them through, meet the federal requirements, and call it good. And I think if we went back to the original intent of legislation that set up agencies like Compass, we would find that was not what they intended to do back in the 1950s and 1960s. And this doesn't mean land use isn't a part of this. This kind of looks fuzzy and Zapruder-like, but it's because I pulled it from an ACHD presentation from 2006, Transportation Land Use Integration Plan. And this talks about this vicious cycle of what we call induced demand that comes with this traditional transportation paradigm. And I won't read it all, but essentially congestion develops, we attack it with something like a road widening, and now we have less congestion, so land further out becomes more developable, so then we have growth pressures to do this on there. And I bring it up mainly because this was a transportation agency putting that in their documents and talking about that paradigm. And it's what led at that time to things like discussions around the blueprint for good growth and getting a better handle on both our land use and transportation decisions. And if you look back at that document and what was in there and think about, my goodness, in 2006, 2007 timeframe, we had a chance to start to rectify some of these disconnects, and we decided as a region not to do it. How different might that be 13 years later? Because we felt the growth pressures were bad from 2002 to 2008. Whew. They've been amplified, and we've noticed that. Economy, well, we got to create jobs, right? Another narrative we get told is like, well, we got to spend all this money on highways because it's what creates the most jobs. Any of you know who the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials is? AASHTO. Like that acronym? It's the National Organization of State DOTs. Our ITD director, Brian Ness, sits on their board of directors. So this isn't data coming from the League of American Bicyclists or America Walks. This is coming from the highway folks that went out to actually try to understand the actual job creation of transportation investments. And they found that when we invest in some of the non-traditional modes of walking, biking, transit, those kind of things, per dollar spent, we create more jobs per dollar than our traditional highway investments. Now, again, that's not saying devote every bit of that $700 million to that. But when we talk about, well, we got to do this to create jobs, we're going to do this to prosper, we forget that there are more ways to make that money go further and the questions we could ask. Next one, federal standards require it. Some of you are here from committees and elected officials. How many times have you heard that phrase, FHWA standards, AASHTO standards? I see some heads nodding. Jim?
All the time.
All the time, right?
Rest that compass.
And what happens if you're an elected official and you hear from an engineer or somebody, it's a standard? What do you think? Do you have an option? No. Why?
You lose the federal money.
Might lose the federal money, right? That's the fear. Well, I'm here to tell you most of that is bunk. We'll come back to this group, AASHTO. Now, their logo looks like it was developed in the 1960s. We were doing that, and it's still their logo today. And they do this book called A Policy on Geometric Design of Highways. It is 1,000 pages long, and it covers everything of guidance on how to do a guardrail and a culvert under a road to traffic lane widths and things called pedestrian level of service and something called target speed. Your tax dollars paid for it, but if you as a member of the public want a copy of it, you got to pay $300. Maybe we can ask the Boise Library to get a copy. Luckily, as a business expense, my Christmas gift to myself this past December was their 2018 edition, and I bought the PDF file of it, but it's password protected. If I could share it, I would. This is what's looked at as like the Bible for traffic engineers and departments like ITD and ACHD. And I don't mean to pick on them. They're not really any better or worse than the same agencies around the country. It's just who we know and who we work with. So the best part about a PDF is if something is a standard, that means it's required, right? Anybody in here an attorney? I'll go back to you, Jim. What does the word shall mean if you're an attorney?
Shall.
Shall.
You don't have a choice.
No choice, right? The great thing about a PDF is I can run a search to try to find the word shall without having to read all 1,036 pages of that. And when I searched that document for the word shall, no matches were found. And even in there, it says, it provides geometric design guidance. This policy is not intended to be a prescriptive design manual, which means there's a lot of flexibility in there. And when I worked at ACHD, we bought ourselves 44 copies of this book, AASHTO. It's the same color green as the old green book. This is from 2004. And it says a guide for achieving flexibility in highway design. They had to produce a whole other 100 and something page guide to get at that statement at the bottom of their own dang book. And when I left ACHD, my boss came up to me and presented this to me as my going away present. And I put it to use. I put that public investment to use in there. Even the Green Book, even when they go out and do presentations on this, federal, state, and local agencies establish standards. Aha. Should not be referred to the Green Book as AASHTO standards and should never refer to it as safety standards. And that's a line of argument we get sometimes. If we don't follow the standard, it's not going to be safe. Key point there, federal, state, and local. ACHD has some policies that take guidance in there and do make it policy, although I don't think even in their policy they use the word shall in there. And when you look at ITD's documents where they've taken this and kind of made it their own, in not too many places will you find the word shall. And the point being there, we have the power to then change that. This isn't something coming down from Uncle Sam and we have to follow it or we lose our money, like apparently you as a policymaker have been told, right? We have the option to do that and influence locals. How many of you ever heard of level of service? What does it mean?
Lots of things to lots of people.
What else does it mean? Level of service. Sounds important, right?
Well, you got to sustain like an AADT,
AADT is
average annual
daily traffic.
daily traffic.
Good. We know somebody's passing their acronym test. Yeah. This long-standing thing in traffic engineering has been level of service A through F. How many of you got a D in school? Hey, somebody's willing to admit it.
Proud of it.
How'd that feel?
Not good.
Not good, right?
Significant delays.
Significant delays. What did your parents think of that D?
Oh, they weren't happy.
They weren't happy. Or was it in college and you were too inebriated the night before and you didn't care either? Or what was the...
That's another story.
Right. What do we think of as F?
Failure.
What? Failure. And I even have some things from some local project meetings where the big display boards talk about traffic is expected to fail in 2035. And it comes from this paradigm. Well, of course, we all want level of service A, free flow with insignificant delays, right? Wouldn't you love to have that commuting into downtown Boise from Meridian or Star every morning? Can we maintain that? Can we build for that? And when we get to the F, we use those words like failure. And policymakers sure as heck don't want to hear that. Well, it's a myth. We think cars have to go fast. That's what the level of service policy says. Nope. AASHTO, failure to achieve a level of service indicated in the Green Book does not constitute a non-standard design decision. Again, it's local choice and local preference, and one we have to make. Federal Highway Administration, let's go up to the level of Uncle Sucker. 2016, their policy office director, Bart McCann, there is no federal mandate for level of service out there. Yet in our long range plans and other things, we kind of treat it like it is. And in this memo from 2016, Federal Highway Administration says, we do not have regulations or policies that require specific minimum level of service values for projects on the national highway system. National highway system is pretty much most of the roads I colored in red in that document. So even our feds say we've got choices at the local level. Traffic forecasts are just one factor to consider when planning and designing projects. Agencies should set expectations for operational performance based on existing and projected traffic conditions, current and proposed land use, context, agency transportation goals, and should also take into account the input of a wide cross-section of project stakeholders. That's what the feds say. So we've got that behind us to ask those questions I want you to ask. So we get down to actually the local level and what your experience is. How many of you have heard that phrase, just go to the nearest crosswalk, pedestrians, you idiots? Just go to the nearest crosswalk, right? Ever we thought about that in an actual policy context? And our biggest fear is, well, if we give the pedestrians more places to cross, we'll delay the cars. We can't do that. Anybody know where this picture's taken?
Is that Glenwood?
That's Glenwood. Cross only at crosswalks, pedestrians, because by God, we put a sign out there. Never mind a blind or visually impaired person could never actually see that. So we've put the highest level of access control on pedestrians. We've told you in a place where we have a 3,500 foot gap between Glenwood and Marigold, you have to walk that far, pedestrians. Yet, after this median for the turn lane, a car can turn, cross, and make any possible movement that they want to make. But hey, pedestrians, go to the nearest crosswalk. And if you don't, and you get hit, who gets blamed?
It's your own damn fault.
Your own damn fault, you idiots. So let's look at that. We teach a training course on walkability, and we've used this often. And let's say I live in the red house, and the green dot is my neighborhood market, a laundromat, a convenience store. And if you haven't looked at convenience stores lately, like Maverick and them, they know they're the new neighborhood markets. And if you look at the things they stock on their shelves, they get that in a lot of ways. And we use this example on Chindan and Garden City, but it could be on anywhere USA type of corridor. So the distance between marked signalized crosswalks on this street is about 1.15 miles.
Wow.
That's where you can get to a signal for that. But I just want to cross the street to get a gallon of milk. I don't want to have to drive and do that, right? I should be able to do that safely because, my goodness, it's only a 4.5-minute walk one way to cross the street, right? 0.22 miles, quarter of a mile. But is that our expectation?
Oh.
I won't get into the idiosyncrasies of unmarked crosswalk laws, because if you try to exert your rights as pedestrians on Chindan Boulevard, you will not have a good result. So what do we ask them to do? Just go to the nearest crosswalk, right? Well, that means I got 1.05 miles to get there. How long does it take you to walk a mile?
15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay? 15 to 20's kind of the norm.
Yeah.
I walk fast. I can do about a mile every 10 minutes. How long does it take an elderly or disabled person to go a mile?
Years.
Years? Could be. So even in the just seemingly innocuous request of just go to the nearest crosswalk, pedestrians, we've taken a 0.22 mile trip, a quarter mile trip, and we've quadrupled it
Flashy.
to a mile.
You gotta get back.
In addition, we have added 21 additional driveway and street conflicts. We never account for that, right? We get the walk signal here even when right turns have a green. And oh, now, and just ask the people who were hit and killed out on Milwaukee and Northview, in some cases you get a left turn arrow that allows the driver to come from another direction across your path, and you might have up to a 3-minute wait just to get the walk signal for that, right?
Eagle Road. Eagle Road, it's like 10 minutes.
10 minutes. It could be longer, yes. I'm being nice here. Being nice here. What if we asked the car to do that? What if we said, you driver, to cross the street, got to drive 20 minutes? What do you think that would look like on Chindan Boulevard?
Torches and pitchforks.
Before that,
Oh, wow.
about 9.8 miles round trip. You would have to drive out past Cloverdale, make a U-turn, and come back. Yet that's the expectation we put on people. And then we have the audacity to say, well, we put in those sidewalks and nobody walks. Right? Well, we've missed part of the point that's going on here. Next one, wide, fast roads are safer. If you followed the speed limit debate in Idaho a few years ago, we got to raise them to 80 because I got to get to my legislative district in Soda Springs 3 minutes faster when I leave the state house, right? And I think in a lot of ways we have a cultural issue related around this speed thing. And again, I could probably do a 3-hour session on this one. But we have a lot of new science and things that are telling us something different. I have this postcard sitting in my office. And I saw it at the Smithsonian and then sought to find a copy of it on eBay. It's from 1906. Motorist jaunting along in the country. Hello, sportsman, have you killed anything? The sportsman says, no, have you? 1906. What do you think led to this type of social statement on a postcard in 1906? What was happening?
People were getting hit by cars.
Okay.
Cars were first starting to take.
Yeah, the advent of the motor age, and even 1906 was pretty darn early for that. A lot of that really didn't come along until the 1920s. There, if you want to read a book by a guy named Peter Norton, he's a researcher out of University of Virginia. It's called Fighting Traffic. And it's about the way our culture shifted at that time. When the first child pedestrian was killed in Baltimore, they put up an obelisk at the intersection. That's how traumatized they were over that. And when you read deeper into it, he talks about this strong lobbying effort by a lot of different interests, some very noble, some maybe not so. You can be the judge of that, to basically rid our streets of people and make way for the fast movement of cars. The traffic engineering profession came out of a call for efficiency from U.S. chambers of commerce to then move cars as quickly as possible in and out of cities. That's where the science and that's where what drives a lot of that profession. And they're starting to get away from that and starting to come about. But those early influences are what are there. And we're starting to realize actually slower traffic is safer traffic in a lot of ways. And I'll just describe some of the subtleties around that. I about swallowed my snuff last year when I was watching a Facebook Live forum with ACHD Commission President Sarah Baker at the time. And I'll give her credit for this. Here's what she said. Level of surface, go back to that thing before, is a comfort measure, not a safety measure. And quite frankly, if you're stuck in traffic and not moving, you're pretty safe. Right? People don't die at 5 miles an hour. A pedestrian, I'll show you the stats later, it grows exponentially with speed. And so this is a good step. Now, I don't know if that's what she meant. Don't know, but it's a good quote to use in these forums. Oregon DOT. How many of you have been to Portland?
Mm-hmm.
How's their traffic?
Sucky.
Sucky. A purposeful decision really in the 70s from a regional planning perspective to not widen the freeways anymore and invest in other modes. Well, now the Oregon DOT is having a fit, and they're proposing this thing called the I-5 Rose Corridor Improvement Project, and I could do a whole other presentation on transportation language. But it says here, part of the project need to spend $450 million to add some amplified on and off ramps is due to safety issues on I-5. And it says it has the highest crash rate in the state. If you're a policymaker, you're a legislator, you're a planning and zoning commissioner, and you hear the state DOT saying, we got the highest crash rate on the state system. We have to do that, right? We got to do something. Well, you got to go to the appendix. And this is their 5-year analysis of the crashes that have occurred in this segment. And I'll call your attention to the top. How many fatal or serious / disabling injuries have occurred in a 5-year period on the road with the highest crash rate in the state? None. And when you look at when the crashes are occurring, for the most part, they're occurring midday, not at the time of day that the traffic models and things are trying to address. And I recognized this at a point in my career when I got a very callous response and said, well, somebody died, that's just one crash. No, wait a minute. One crash is someone's life. One serious or disabling injury is a life-changing event. What are we trying to prevent here? We're trying to prevent a bunch of no-injury crashes. Now, nobody wants to be an a fender bender or have the mirror ding, but that's what I call a motorist inconvenience crash, right? And it goes back to what Sarah said here. If you're in traffic and not moving, you're pretty safe. It's kind of what it's showing here. And we're proposing to put $500 million into the highest crash rate in the state that has this. And I go, good for you, Oregon DOT. You've done a hell of a job with safety. A heck of a job on that project. But we're still trying to do it under this guise of a crash rate and safety. When we look at the severity, it's not really there. And this is a problem in the United States as a whole. As a developed nation, as a wealthy nation, we have the highest traffic crash fatality rate in the world, and one of the few where it's actually going up in a lot of ways. And you might have seen the stuff last week on pedestrian deaths, specifically going up for a lot of different factors. And what we're starting to do is look at things a little bit differently. We've lived under this guise that, hey, I'm going to live on the cul-de-sac. It's safer, right? Well, probably on an individual basis, maybe. I don't know. Again, looking at an analysis of pre-1950s transportation networks, something you'd see, you know, kind of the Boise Bench was the last era of that. Toward post-1950s, your chance as a driver, as a pedestrian, as a bicyclist, 30% higher of being severely injured in this road network pattern and 50% here. Why?
You're forcing traffic onto arterials.
Forcing traffic, more traffic out there, putting them on higher speed roads for the most part, and giving nobody an option to make a local trip without being exposed to that road, right? So that's kind of the science behind that. So even we're starting to get back, you'll see even more development patterns even here in the Boise region with greater connectivity, at least within the square mile, in recognizing there's a lot of operational efficiencies that come with that. National Transportation Safety Board, usually only know them when there's a plane or a train crash, right? They put out a study on speed-related crashes in the United States in 2017. If you've ever gone and asked as a neighborhood, can we get the speed limit changed? How many of you have heard the response, well, the 85th percentile rule helps determine the speed limit, blah, 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 blah. I see a couple of head nods for that, right? This has long been held as one of these sacred rules of traffic engineering, and based on the theory from one study on rural roads in the 1950s, that if 85% of the traffic is traveling at that speed, it is the least likelihood involvement of a crash. Which maybe for a rural road, it is. I don't know. But what did you have to distract you in a car in 1955?
Your can of hairspray.
Can of hairspray, maybe? How many radio stations did you get?
Ashtray, maybe you had an ashtray.
Maybe you had an ashtray there. Did we have drive-through restaurants?
Nah.
Were we eating in cars? We sure as heck weren't texting and going between 85 different Sirius XM. NTSB said in this, the rule, the speed limit is dated research and may not hold up under scrutiny. Now think about that the next time you hear that as an excuse to not lower the speed limit or do something different on your street. Raising speed limits based on the 85th percentile begets higher speeds, thus higher 85th percentile rules. They found this in a study in Utah, that when they raised the speed limits to 80, the average speeds went up to like 84. Well, we got to go back in and do an 85th percentile analysis, and we're going to find they're going faster, so we should just raise the speed limits to 85. In California, they found that raising speed limits, and this is important for those of you on the neighborhood level, increased speeds on local roads once people got off the interstates. And I wish we'd have had the forethought in Idaho to do that. We've heard anecdotally in both Twin Falls and Pocatello from their police departments that they feel like they've noticed that difference in those cities since those speed limit changes went in. And when you hear the 85th percentile, nothing in that accounted for areas of people walking and biking and the influences there. And actually, the Federal Highway Administration has guidance on using what's called the 50th percentile rule to set speed limits in certain areas where we want to prioritize, instead of the fast movement of cars, better overall mobility. And even this tweet from January, forget the gobbledygook, basically the National Association and Committee of Traffic Engineers has agreed to forward the recommendations to move away from this to Federal Highway Administration. So the one thing, MUTCD, which actually is a federal standard with shall words, can be altered and changed to better reflect this possible outcome. And what all this starts to point to is something called Vision Zero, or sustainable safety. Has anybody heard of that? What is it?
Zero deaths.
Zero deaths, a vision of zero deaths. What else does it involve? Anybody know more details on it? A lot of it's about speed management and recognizing the basic physics of that. Our traditional approach is traffic deaths are inevitable, kind of just comes with the territory. And to address it, we're going to perfect human behavior. Don't you ever dive distracted. You better wear a reflective vest. You bike cyclists, you should always wear a helmet. We've spent 90 years finger wagging at people trying to perfect human behavior. And as a result, we have the highest traffic fatality rates of wealthy nations. Traditionally, we've looked to prevent collisions, and you saw that in the Oregon DOT data. We focused on individual responsibility, getting at that level. And that saving lives is expensive. And the Vision Zero is really a different approach. It was pioneered in Sweden and kind of perfected in the Netherlands in a lot of ways. And had we adopted that premise in the 1970s when those countries did, instead of 40,000 deaths a year, we predict we would have 20,000 a year in the country. And it's looking at saying deaths are preventable and we can do something about it. We have to integrate human failing into design. We have to recognize we are human. To err is human. We will make mistakes. We just need to make sure that when we make those mistakes, the results are not fatal and the results are not severe or disabling. So if you go back to that Oregon example, Oregon DOT has achieved Vision Zero. They've had no fatal or serious injuries on that interstate in 5 years. Well, now they want to make traffic safer and potentially compromise that. We take a safe systems approach. One of the things we hear is like, well, they have higher speed limits in Europe. They also have greater penalties for violating them. And they also have a lot more automated enforcement than we tend to have, which is kind of the truth serum in some of that. So I want you to take a look at the next 4 slides. So I'm going to ask you to put your highway engineer hat on. And I'm going to show you 4 pictures. And I want you to tell me what changes with this road. All right, it's a tough one. What changed?
Only the speed limit.
Only the sign, right? Parents, your kids are much safer crossing here than there, right? Is that what we're saying? Yet this is what we've done. We've got this in so many areas. This is a highway near where I used to live in North Carolina, and I probably came closest to dying and trying to find the places to pull off to go take these series of images to show this happening there. We can't do this. This is outsourcing safety to education and enforcement and saying, well, it's not our fault who designed the road. They need to follow signs and the police need to enforce it. Well, no. The approach is, if we expect people to drive this way, and what the AASHTO Green Book says is we need to set a target speed and design for it. If we want people to go 35, we need to put design cues within the road that are self-enforcing for that. And so as we make this expectation, as we come into a town to have 4 different speed expectations, we need to alter the design along the way to do that. We have a similar one on Simplot Boulevard in Caldwell. We don't quite get the 25 mile an hour school zone because it's an industrial area. And when we took a group of people out there, we asked them to walk on this sidewalk with their back toward traffic. What do you think that did to the census? And one of the most amazing comments we got from Caldwell Police was, we hate doing our job out here. We fear for the safety of our officers in having to pull somebody over because they think the road is designed in a way that doesn't help them. And they were also the group that said, we love our roundabouts. Why? They've done away with our traffic crashes. Roundabouts are kind of the classic example of speed management and speed expectations coming into that and where that works. And we've got enough studies from state DOTs to show that they pretty much eliminate the fatal and severe crashes. And guess what? They have a few more cars knocking down signs. Ooh, nobody's getting hurt in that situation. When we come back to a pedestrian perspective, this is why it matters. You know, and it's okay. We're going to have our Eagle roads and our Chindan roads in some sections, but we got to make sure where other functions are happening that we account for this. So on the left, we have the risk of death at those ages if the human body is impacted by a vehicle at that speed. SUVs have greater mass and a height that hits you in a more vulnerable area. I've not seen research yet that accounts for the big rise in SUVs, so I suspect it would look different. But the other piece, how many times, Steve? Well, the pedestrian came out of nowhere. Well, if you're driving 40 miles an hour, your focal point and your vision is so far down the road, you don't see things that are happening to the side of you. Think about that next time when you drive. How far you're looking down the road based on the speed you're traveling versus if you're driving slower, your peripheral vision is much greater. That's kind of some of the science behind those two facets of that. But where will all the traffic go? If we don't widen the roads, we'll just have congestion everywhere. It's why I said I'll go back and renege on my water flow theory thing, because we tend to look at traffic as water flowing into a drain or a set of pipes. And of course, when we don't have a lot of water, it's coming out of the drain pretty fast. We reach the maximum capacity and more comes out. But as it fills up, we start to detract on that capacity a little bit. And there's some assumptions behind that I think are fundamentally flawed, and I'll point out. The better analogy would be this one, a gas. How does a gas operate in space? Fills up the space that you give. And I think that's a slightly better analogy that we just saw come to fruition in Seattle with what they did as #viaduct, the big Alaskan Way viaduct. The highway that was built on the riverfront there in the 60s, tore it down to replace it with a tunnel. But in the meantime, neither one of them was going to be open for several weeks. This just happened at the start of this year. USA Today story from Associated Press. Closure of Seattle's Alaskan Way viaduct will stall traffic for weeks. January 9th, 2019. January 24th, the Carmageddon that wasn't. The cars just disappeared. Where did they all go? A spokesperson for the traffic data company INRIX, which tracks your cell phone data, and they have better data than any traffic model, told them that they just disappeared. And everybody's sitting there go, why did we build this big tunnel? And the day the tunnel opened up, it was packed full again.
Well, where'd they go?
Where'd they go, right? So this is one, this one also looks old because I've used it for years. You know, it's another new highway. Well, the model made me do it. The traffic model made me do it, right?
Where did they go?
Where did they go? I'll get to that in a second. I don't know where they went. I don't know where they went, but all the data people were amazed. The traffic engineers didn't know what the heck was going on because their traffic model said this is going to take all, what was it, 70,000 trips, 90,000 trips. We got to put them on I-5. We're going to put them on local roads. It's going to be a mess. It didn't happen. Well, one of the things that happens in traffic modeling, and this is the State and Pierce Park intersection study, is we get very mesmerized, especially as policymakers, in a number. Because, by God, if I got to make a decision as a public policy decision and spend a lot of money, I want to know that the numbers are accurate. So if I came in there to you, and I can't pick on Jim anymore since he's gone, and said, well, we did a 2040 build forecast for AM and PM intersection volumes at State and Pierce Park, and the PM is in parentheses, the AM is not, and by goodness, 280 cars are going to be turning right at that intersection in 2040 if we build this. Sounds pretty certain, right? Mm-hmm. At least the engineers have gotten to the point of rounding this off. Yeah. To like increments of 5. I would do this and they would still leave like decimal points in there. And like, where do you get 13/100ths of a car, right? But still, if you're a policymaker and you go, we need to spend $7 million on this intersection because this many people are going to be turning right, this many people are going to be going through, that sounds like a lot of certainty. That's giving you peace of mind in your decision. And then we use things like this. I won't get into all this. The Qs, the 50th percentile and the 95th percentile, eastbound left, eastbound through. And oh my goodness, now we've gone to a function of volume of capacity and delay. And we've done what I call, we've confused precision and accuracy. Just because this number looks very precise, it may or may not be accurate in there. And here's why. So we talk about where did the cars go. When you see a traffic model output, there's some assumptions that are in there. The land development will occur for the next 25 years exactly as we predicted. Where does that happen?
Nowhere.
Nowhere. I was on the modeling committee for Compass 2004 to 2008. And the reason I use State Street in this is we were in a discussion about the model. And the model is based on an allocation of land uses, residential homes, commercial uses, industrial uses, and they run these models. And they said, you know, we think for the next 20 years, the city of Boise is going to average 2,000 residential permit approvals per year. And Star, you're going to average 190. Okay? And the Star City Council person at the time who was representing that, because they hadn't been incorporated that long after that and didn't have much staff, said, I think we're going to grow more at like 230 per year. Well, that's 40 more. We have growth control totals. We have to take the 40 from somewhere else. The planning director for City of Boise said, we'll give them the 40, we'll give them the 40. They didn't want to engage in an hour-long discussion about that. That's what went into this model. Horse trading of rooftops at a meeting in 2005. And now you mean to tell me that we've condemned Smokey Davis for turn lanes and taken property away because we had a horse trading of rooftops that wasn't based on any real science? So you see, we get at the underlying assumptions here, why we go back to some of that early stuff. This traffic model shouldn't be the only determining factor. Gas will always be cheap enough to make long driving trips possible. When I go back to that data of $700 million spent, and here's what happened to congestion in Ada County between ITD and ACHD expenditures. If you look at the year-to-year metrics, do you know the only years that that cost and the time went down?
The recession.
2008, 2009, 2010. Why? We drove less. We drove less. Speed will always be the primary driver of trip-making decisions.
Wrong.
Transportation decisions will not impact land development. Nobody will ever decide not to take a trip or go at a different time of day due to traffic or other factors. Where do I get this from? A 2006-07 document from ACHD that talked about traffic modeling and maybe going toward a different way of looking at things called variable level of service. It's about a 28-page document that was part of a $1 million effort. Those 28 pages were never adopted. Probably why I left the region at the time. We get in there and we look at this. We spend all our money. We spend that $700 million looking at this. And if you look at the economics of it, all the other time of day that's not being used is what we might call waste. And what we were trying to get at with variable level of service was go, you know what? AM, PM, it sucks everywhere. If we could build our way out of congestion by widening roads, LA would have shown us how to do it by now. Atlanta would have, pardon the pun, paved the way. And so would have Houston, but they haven't. And our goal at the time was say, maybe we look at investing our money, what if we have a spike here? What if we have traffic congestion at 10 o'clock in the morning or at 8 o'clock at night? Maybe that's where we need to look at where we might have to address it with some of these traditional things because something else is off in what's going in there. And that was kind of the goal. I'm not saying that that would happen everywhere, and we'd still have our corridors to deal with peak hour things, but does the intersection of Ustick and Maple Grove require 2 left turn lanes and a dedicated right turn lane that constitutes 30,000 additional square feet in that intersection? Is that the road we want to put that much money? I don't know. Those are the decisions. Last little myth, and then you're going to solve some problems. It's what the market commands. It's just the market driving things. We choose to drive. How many of you have ever heard that term social engineering? Right? And I love this cartoon. So Ian Lockwood is where some of these came from. Ian Lockwood is an engineer, used to be the transportation director for City of Fort Lauderdale. He worked on a lot of that ACHD stuff 13 years ago when he was with a firm called Gladding Jackson. And he actually happens to be a hell of a cartoonist in this realm, which for cynical guys like me is great. You know, it may look like a guy building sidewalk, but it's really part of a left-wing plot to social engineer us out of our cars, right? So let's look at the concept of social engineering for a second. I'm going back to Asheville, where I used to live, a city of 88,000. State DOT was proposing a $1 billion investment into a highway interchange, right? In that same footprint, we had a whopping $100 investment in a bus stop. It left a woman in a wheelchair sitting in a gutter of an interstate on-ramp. Yet we were told our state couldn't pay to do that. Nobody rides transit. We invest money in transit. It's social engineering, right? And in that same footprint, $1 billion investment. Sharrows. Share the road, cyclists. Take the lane, Granny. That's how you should get to work. We put all this money in bicycling facilities and nobody uses it. This is in Nashville, Tennessee. And a few miles away, $35 million for a new interstate on-off ramp and what's called a diverging diamond, right? So let's look a little bit differently at what we might think has been social engineering. Now I'm going to go back to the Cold War for this one. Reduction of urban vulnerability, revisiting 1950s American suburbanization as civil defense. 30-page document, really, really fascinating, and kind of sets the tone of a lot of things that were happening in our post-war era, especially related to vulnerability from a nuclear attack. It is wrong to believe that post-war American suburbanization prevailed because of the public choice. Ordinary consumers had little real choice in the basic pattern that resulted. The U.S. Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Air Defense Command told the 1954 Washington Conference of Mayors, to our possible enemies, the 100 biggest cities do not mean historic streets and beautiful parks and school systems in which you have pride or the churches which you are fountains of faith. They may mean to them only those aerial forces and weapons required to produce the 100 pinpointed minutes of atomic hell on Earth necessary for their destruction. Now, can you imagine 9 years after the end of World War II? Think of that context and what we unleashed on Japan and what we knew other countries were developing. If you were the mayor of Boise at that time, sitting in that, what would you have thought? Who are you going to question? The U.S. Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Air Defense talking to you. And there was a seminal report that came out from atomic scientists in 1951 that really said we need to move toward defense through decentralization, directing all new construction away from congested city areas to their outer fringes and suburbs in low density and continuous development. 1955, the Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, and this included economists, urban planners, academics, all walks of life on this. It is recommended that consideration be given to redirecting grant and aid programs, housing and highways, in interest of reducing the vulnerability of our cities. So we had a very big urban decentralization program. It was embedded in our housing policies. It's why getting low interest loans for single-family houses is a much easier thing to do historically. We've corrected some of those things. Ask a developer who wants to develop mixed-use, multi-family, multi-story development with commercial on the bottom versus when they develop traditional big box or single family, how many mortgage bids they get on those properties. I taught a class for several years at Western Carolina University, and I had a guy who worked for Biltmore Farms Company, a developer there related to the Biltmore family, or Vanderbilts. And he used to be on the Federal Reserve Board of Charlotte. And he said, when I came in to develop this mixed-use town center, kind of like if you took the village, the size, but did something more like Bound Crossing, if you know those areas. And he said, no, we should do traditional development. We'll get 10 or 11 different lenders. We'll get better interest rates. And the family said, no, we want to do this mixed-use development. They got one lender to it. So even at that institutional level, we've got things to overcome. On the heels of this, what happened? The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. And a lot of those same things. So you can definitely see how the fervor and stuff built up. In a lot of ways, we still live under that particular paradigm. When we talk about transit, one of the things that gets excoriated over transit is, oh my God, it's subsidized, right? How many times have you heard that? Oh my God, it's some subsidy. Our highways are heavily subsidized from non-road user fees, and I'll give you a local example in a second, not to mention all the other influences that go into that. And it's not to pit one against another, but we just need to admit that every mode of transportation is heavily subsidized. And like I said at the beginning, go back into a more honest dialogue about where we want our investments to be. So knowing some of this, and knowing what's been happening at the federal level, remember that check I showed you with Governor Otter and them and the $90 million? Well, I went in and actually looked at the funding sources that ITD is using to widen I-84 in Canyon County. You might have seen the article I wrote last October. And it's a catchy title. It was meant to be provocative. Hidden Subsidies, How the I-84 Widening is Built by Pedestrians, Bicyclists, Transit Riders, and yes, Smokers. And in that, I found 57% of the estimated $150 million cost based on the funding sources is subsidized from non-road user fees, meaning gas taxes, vehicle registration fees are not going to 57% of the cost of that project. So what are we talking about? Well, of the $90 million that's there is coming from the federal government. Since 2005, the Highway Trust Fund, the gas taxes you pay at the pump, has failed to account for the money they've distributed through that, to the tune of roughly, in that time frame, 30% of the funding. So right off the bat, $30 million of that $90 million is a straight up subsidy. And the rest of it comes from, and I can never get the acronym right, it's TRED, TREC, Transportation, TCED, Transportation, Congestion, and Economic Development Fund set up by the Idaho legislature. Where does that money come from? Sales taxes, which everyone pays, and cigarette tax. That's out there, which good for them. I'm glad we're diversifying our funding, you know, probably a necessary project, but I've heard too many times from traffic engineers, well, we're not going to include pedestrian bicyclists, or they don't pay gas taxes. They even had a Texas DOT person respond to me through like unofficial means in saying that, God, you don't even know where your money comes from at that level. So let's stop thinking about those things. And this is coming out of the Congressional Budget Office and FHWA of the revenues from gas taxes and the outlays. And so what was a $12 billion deficit in that year is continued and projected to grow. And we could debate, is it a funding problem? Is it a spending problem? You know, probably somewhere in between. But let's not, you know, excoriate transit for some subsidy while not admitting that a lot of subsidies go into our road system, and thinking back to that choice. So I kind of joke, if we look at the brand new State and Veterans intersection, 150 feet wide of concrete. Wow. Runway 10L at the Boise Airport. So the cynical side of me, going back to the civil defense and all that stuff, said, maybe we just want to use State Street for touch and goes of B-52 bombers. Right? So it's going to be that wide. Think about that. Think about the next time you go through that area and go through that corridor and think Collister's going to look the same. Pierce Park's going to look the same. State and Glenwood's going to look the same. And think about that. Think about that the next time you fly out of here. You're on that window side of the plane, you get to the end of the runway and you make that turn, and look at that width. Think about that. Can we maintain that? Do we have other options? That's the stuff I want you to think about. Not saying we don't have the need to do something out there. And to ACHD's credit, while we may think that median U-turn is crazy, it's a heck of a lot safer for pedestrians than the conventional intersections. I don't like that it's so wide. I don't like the private property that had to be taken in perpetuity and taken off the tax rolls. But without that U-turn, we would not have got the pedestrian signals a quarter mile down the road on each side of it. It gave us the opportunity for that. It gave us a wide sidewalk that acts as a pathway in a lot of areas. And it provided that neighborhood with different type of access to the grocery store and things. So, like I said, that's not to castigate it and say that's there. So, we have about 15 minutes left. I want you just to sit around your table, take a few notes, and think about what you would do. Compass has, from 2018 to 2040, I think, about $1.5 billion that they say is available to this region for transportation. That's if you take into account federal money coming into ITD and Valley Ride, ACHD's property taxes, City of Nampa's property taxes, impact fees, although if you're in Nampa and you saw the impact fee lately, I suspect that number will change dramatically. And think about it. What if we actually had the opportunity, no strings attached, to put $1.8 billion in the pot and divide it up? I'm going to give you a couple of sideboards. One of the things is maintaining what we have, and what Compass talks about is still a large bit of that money goes to maintenance. So think 50% of that. So now your budget is $750 million. Now, you could decide to tear down some infrastructure. That's on the table. Some cities are doing that in some ways. That would certainly lower that maintenance burden out there. But your decision. Expand the highway system, primarily for cars like we've been doing. Create a functional public transit system, whatever that is to you. I don't care if it's everybody taking Uber, light rail, whatever. Creating safe, connected networks of active transportation to link jobs, community destinations, and public transit. And one of the things I'll say with that is, I don't think there should be a valid expectation that if you live in Nampa or Star or Meridian, that you're going to be able to ride a bike back and forth to downtown Boise. You know, that's not the realistic expectation. Nobody really has that time. We've got some hardcore folks I know that have $150 pants that do it. But if you are succumbed to having to drive to get there, wouldn't you like to at least be able to go to a park, a school, a grocery store, buy that gallon of milk in your own neighborhood and not be relegated to the car to have to do it? So if you live out in those areas and are thinking differently about this, think about what that means for that. And then others, have fun with it. Maybe we build a gondola there. Maybe autonomous vehicles are going to solve our problems. Maybe we want Zeppelin-based transit. Let's just float all the way in there. Or maybe e-scooters are going to be the ultimate thing. So take a few minutes around your table and just think about that. $750 million, if you want to tear down I-184 to save some maintenance money and get you probably $30 million extra, you can do that too. As I say here, any community can have good traffic, but it's up to each person to sacrifice outworn habits and personal conveniences to get it. Now think about that being said in the 1950s versus today.